about the Woodrow Wilson Center, not so much for those in this room, but for those who are watching from elsewhere. The Wilson Center is the nation's official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We are frequently referred to as a think tank, though in fact we're somewhat different. We're an institute for advanced research. We try to focus on President Wilson's twin passions of scholarship and public policy. We define our mission as bringing into the same room and promoting a discussion between academics and policymakers. And I think this program this afternoon is a good example of that. I want to welcome those here as well as those watching on their computer screens. I'm Bob Hathaway. I direct the Asia program here. And we are particularly happy about this event because we are hosting one of our own here today. If I may say one or two words, first of all, about upcoming events, because we have several events in the next several weeks that I think many of you will be interested in. Next Tuesday, the 27th, in the afternoon at 3:30, we are hosting Lieutenant General Carl Eikenberry, who has left Afghanistan recently, having served there as commander of combined forces in Afghanistan. He will be talking about the situation in Afghanistan. This is an off-the-record event. That is an off-the-record event, and it is an event that we expect a large turnout for, and so we are asking everybody to RSVP. So if you would like to attend that event, we would be delighted to have you, but do know that we will be cutting off RSVPs at some point, and so RSVP sooner rather than later. I'm also pleased to announce that on Friday, the 13th of April, we will be hosting the Indian Finance Minister here, as well as the U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce, as well as a number of other distinguished panelists. So I would urge you to look for more information on this event, either on our website or for those of you who get our invitations via email. You'll be hearing from us in another week or so with more details on this event. Turning now to the business at hand for today, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Francine Frankel, who is an old friend of mine personally, as well as an old friend of the Woodrow Wilson Center. She is a fellow here at the Wilson Center this year, on leave from the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, where she has taught since 1979. In 1992, at Penn, she was the moving force behind and the founder of the Center for the Advanced Study of India. She remained director of that center until just last year, when she stepped down so that she could spend more time on her own scholarship. She is well known in the community of India scholars. She's a distinguished scholar, the author or editor of many books. Perhaps her best-known book is India's Political Economy, 1947 to 2004, the second edition of which was published in 2005. The Wilson Center Press also published one of her recent books, a co-edited book entitled The India-China Relationship, What the United States Needs to Know. While at the center this year, she is working on a book project looking at the challenges of establishing a U.S.-India partnership, where she is focusing, I believe, on the divergent historical and cultural worlds of policymakers in Delhi and Washington. Francine, we are delighted to have you here, and I turn things over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Bob. It's my great pleasure to be at the center and to have the wonderful opportunity of meeting old friends and the time to do some thinking about the past. I've been so immersed in current policies that it's a true luxury to be able to do this. I think most of us are aware of the current foreign policy initiative of the Bush administration. And in fact, that may prove to be the best hope for establishing a long-term partnership between the U.S. and India. But the U.S.-India Strategic Partnership, which I will not be speaking about today, is very much a work in progress. Historically, converging interests have proved insufficient to establish a working partnership in the absence of a climate of trust. And this climate is much better now. It's still fully to be realized. The largest study from which today's talk is drawn focuses on the challenges to forging a long-term partnership embodied in the broader cultural and historical factors that have prevented U.S. and Indian policymakers from managing outstanding issues to achieve a close bilateral bond. The research analyzes the making of foreign policy in the United States and India. It uses comparable archival resources to reconstruct the perceptual and political worlds of policymakers in both countries during the formative period of their relations. It draws upon the post-1947 closed collection of the Nehru Papers, declassified U.S. documents for the same period, supplemented by declassified British Foreign Office documents, memoirs, and interviews. I propose today to concentrate on the foundation of foreign policy thinking, which came to dominate the attitude of policymakers in both India and the United States, and which influenced policy on both sides for more than 4 decades. Important perspectives were established very early with respect to Asia. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, which saw the rise of Asian nationalism. It saw the establishment of the People's Republic of China in October 1949, and the Korean War from June 1950 until the end of 1953. These are the specific references for the arguments I will make in this paper. Before getting into substance, I want to make a preliminary remark about the asymmetrical relationship between the United States and India. There are many ways in which that is true, but one of the most interesting, I find, is that from 1947 to 1964, the broad principles of India's foreign policy, as well as day-to-day decisions, were set down by Jawaharlal Nehru. In the early 1950s, he had some 3 or 4 permanent staff in the Ministry of External Affairs. He had about 130 Foreign Service offices, a cabinet committee on foreign policy of no particular expertise, and virtually no expert advisory bodies. Defense chiefs were deliberately excluded from all sensitive civilian discussion. The Home Ministry provided intelligence mainly on domestic affairs. Nehru relied for information and sometimes advice from ambassadors at key posts, particularly London, Washington, Peking, New York, the UN, and for most of this period, from the ubiquitous Krishna Menon. This in itself is the subject of a separate chapter in my book. I don't think I could do justice to it here. Just as a trivial contrast in a way, but one that's also illuminating, if we look at the size of the U.S. State Department in this same period that we're talking about, the early 1950s, there was a staff of 186 in the Office of the Secretary of State, 118 additional officers in geographic and political divisions, 59 embassies, 14 legations, 196 consular offices established around the world. And the department appropriation was by then over $33 million. Buttressing this, the National Security Act in 1947 created the National Security Council and the CIA. And this is represented here in the slide. It is an exaggeration. It's something that's been said to me, but in the end I haven't found it to be an outrageous exaggeration, that whatever was in the mind of Jawaharlal Nehru became the foreign policy of India. Nehru's attitudes were quite pronounced before India achieved independence in 1947, when serious polarization had already taken place in the United Nations between blocs led by the United States and the Soviet Union. His classic statement, frequently quoted, was, "We propose to keep away from the power politics of groups aligned against one another, which have in the past led to world wars and which may again lead to disasters on an even vaster scale." In practice, Nehru himself recognized that it would be very difficult to carry out this policy. Neither group appreciated an attitude of neutrality. Each thought those who are not with them are against them. Nehru's policy did not just excite suspicion, but it also provoked irritation. His corollary assumption was that India's position, I'm quoting him, is a key one in world affairs, and as our internal and external strength grows, we shall be able to play a more and more important part. In the interim, Nehru insisted that India should be treated as an equal of the great powers, both because of her civilizational greatness and her future great power role, most especially in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia. The basis of Nehru's claim to natural leadership in Asia and concepts of India's future role in Southeast Asia were astutely described in a March 1949 Department of State intelligence report, which explained India's grounds for asserting primacy in Southeast Asia as a belief in the advantages of cultural manifest destiny and active efforts to promote India's claim to be the cultural fountainhead of the new Asia. This was apparent in Nehru's organization even before independence of the Asian Relations Conference, which brought 243 delegates to New Delhi for a 10-day meeting. And Nehru found it very fitting that India should be the host of the first Asia meeting. And the reason he gave was that geographically she is so situated to be the meeting point of Western and Northern and Eastern and Southeast Asia. He did not refrain from saying, if you want to know India, You have to go to Afghanistan, Western Asia, Central Asia, China, Japan, the countries of Southeast Asia, because you find in all of these places evidence of the vitality of India's culture. In other settings, many regional conferences attended by representatives of India. India portrayed its role as that of a big brother helping smaller brothers to the extent that they need help. Nehru personally enjoyed a natural position of preeminence among his contemporaries. He was legendary for his self-sacrifice during the nationalist movement. This endowed him with moral authority, which seamlessly integrated with the political power conferred by elective office on him as first Prime Minister of independent India. Together, they allowed him to assume or assert the role of leader of Asia against attempts by European powers to reassert their imperial control. I will only mention here Nehru's initial effort on the world stage, which brought him a great deal of prestige, and that was his organization of an Asiatic conference as early as January 1949 to discuss the Indonesian situation after the Dutch invaded Java and tried to reimpose colonial rule over large parts of Indonesia. He was able to bring again to New Delhi delegates from 19 countries, extending from Ethiopia and Egypt to the Philippines and New Zealand, and to pass resolutions that went beyond what the United Nations was able to do. And he sent his own message to Loy Henderson, then the ambassador in Delhi, saying that unless the Dutch adopted a more reasonable attitude, there would be chaos in Indonesia. And Henderson conveyed this message in his own language by telling the State Department that the Republicans in Indonesia would be replaced by commie-dominated leaders. So this was very much in the mind of Nehru, and it was very much in the mind of leaders of the Western countries and of those who were engaged in national struggles. Nehru was very concerned, in fact, that the United States and Great Britain didn't understand the urgency of granting freedom not only to the Indonesians, but to withdrawing support from countries like the Netherlands and the French, France, that were engaged in resisting nationalist movements. And his advice at that point was meant to be helpful. Basically, he was saying to the United States and to Great Britain, you really don't understand the revolutionary changes in this region. And what you do when you help colonial countries suppress nationalist movements is you alienate the most popular forces in these countries. And you don't understand how easy it is for them to conclude that by your actions you are resurrecting imperialism. in their countries. Nehru tried, I think, his best to be a kind of mentor or teacher to those who made the decisions that ended in these kinds of conflicts with nationalist movements. But he became even more concerned because in the absence of Western support for nationalist struggles in Asia, communists were moving in. He wrote a note to himself toward the end of June 1949, which is interesting. He believed that the communist parties in these countries, and you have to remember that India itself had a communist party, and that communist party was directed from Moscow. He wrote, the communist parties of these countries do not think at all in terms of the countries concerned, or of the conditions prevailing there, or of their freedom, or of the betterment of the people, but rather of a wider world policy in which the interests of the Soviet Union are paramount. The fear of world war leads them to think it will be to the interests of the Soviet Union to have a weak, disjointed, and chaotic Southeast Asia in the event of a world crisis. I will return to the point later in the paper that Nehru, while distrusting the motives of Soviet-supported communist parties in smaller countries of Southeast Asia, did not express alarm at the imminent rise to power in China of a strong centralized communist regime, and this becomes a main theme that I will address a bit later on. I want to spend a brief bit of time on Nehru's first visit to the United States in October 1949. This was probably the closest he ever came to considering in an academic way, as an exercise, the question, why not align with the U.S. somewhat and build up our military and economic strength? The Truman administration, influenced by Nehru's entry on the world stage, in calling the Asian Conference and the size and importance of India, which Loy Henderson referred to in a nice phrase, its specific gravity, made every effort to treat Nehru with respect as leader of the most populous non-communist nation and spokesman for all the newly independent millions of Asia. At the least, they hoped to overcome Nehru's suspicions that the U.S. was attempting to buttress colonialism and that it was indifferent to the nationalism then sweeping Asia. This visit has normally been described as unsuccessful. And what is interesting is to read Nehru's contemporaneous letters, several letters, which are written in an exhilarative, or in a sense of exhilaration, that the main purpose of his visit has been fulfilled and that it would achieve rich results in forging a closer bond between the United States and India. He goes on for great length, using words like having an experience that was extraordinary, overwhelming, producing a great deal of friendly feeling and interest toward India, a desire to cooperate, and so on. And then, of course, he says, and I've done this without commitments on our part, and always maintaining India's integrity and independence. And of course that becomes the problem in the relationship. The U.S. did have an agenda and did want commitments. But at this time, there was one opportunity which might have opened up for India-U.S. collaboration. And it emerges from a discussion, again, that's usually depicted as unfortunate, between Nehru and then U.S. Secretary of State Acheson. The issues on which Nehru and Acheson agreed were many more than on which they disagreed. They disagreed on two issues. The first was the need for a quick settlement of Kashmir, and that reflected the persistence of Anglo-U.S. hopes for an end to conflict between India and Pakistan that could free up their resources for a common front against communism. So always this is the preoccupation of policymakers in the U.S. And in the U.K. at this time. This gap on Kashmir was meant to be an unending one. But there was one area of disagreement that was minor, and it was on a very significant subject. The second issue concerned quick recognition of the new Chinese regime. There was at that time no disagreement in principle between Nehru and Acheson. Both men agreed on the complete failure of the Kuomintang, and some of you may be aware that Acheson had the State Department publish a 1,000-page white paper in the summer of 1949 detailing the incompetence and corruption of the nationalists responsible for their own defeat. The difference involved the timing of recognition. Nehru, not being wholly candid, cited India's proximity to China and said he was inclined toward early recognition. Acheson, not entirely candid, said he needed more time to build domestic support. But like Nehru, believed that it was essential to adjust to the new realities in China and extend early recognition of the PRC in order to encourage greater independence of China from the Soviet Union. The U.S. Secretary of State at that time was inclined to keep the agreement of the three great allies in the 1943 Cairo Declaration that Formosa would revert back to the Japanese, to the Chinese, and to do that as a signal of America's good intentions toward the new China regime. What Acheson didn't say, which I think was simply not politic at the moment, was that he was having a great deal of difficulty prevailing with this position against mounting attacks by Republicans and other critics at the do-nothing policy of the Acheson State Department to help the nationalists. In the end, the State Department and Acheson himself was very vulnerable to McCarthy's loss argument that communists and leftists inside the government had been responsible for the defeat of the nationalists. And they denied Acheson the support for recognition of the PRC. The United States, as you know, continued to recognize Chang's Formosa, or Taiwan. Atchison's policy, which had been phrased as staying on the right side of Asian nationalism, afterwards collapsed, and the most promising opening for cooperation between the United States and India in Asia was closed down, I would say, for decades. Now, we then go to the factors that contributed to the buildup of suspicions and resentments that increasingly characterized Indo-U.S. relations. The most important in solidifying American political distrust of India's genuine neutrality and India's apprehensions about America's preference for dedicated allies and for a military solution to every problem, even at the risk of world war, derived from the two crises that we'll discuss that developed within 1 month of each other. On June 25th, 1950, North Korean troops suddenly crossed the international border of South Korea and launched an offensive war with the aim of liberating the people of South Korea and unifying the whole country. We are very familiar with the Korean War. We are less familiar with the other crisis on the Asian continent, when about 3 weeks later, on July 16, 1950, India received the first reports that Chinese troops were moving toward Tibet, the buffer state on her northern border. Now, the reaction of the Truman administration to the outbreak of the Korean War and of India to the Chinese aggression against Tibet were based on diametrically different approaches and worldviews. The interaction of these two aggressions, each involving China, affected India and the United States differently. The India government, as I will describe, was cross-pressured and followed what seemed like policies biased in favor of the Soviet Union and China, despite its constant references to following a neutral position and judging crises or problems on their merits. The contradictions in Indian policies, or between Indian policies and Indian rhetoric, raised suspicions in the United States about India's real motives. These suspicions intensified India's resentment that the United States did not really care about the support of democracies. And Nehru made references that seem unreasonable on paper, that the U.S., in fact, was so disinterested in democracies that it was lining up with the old fascist powers. And here he had in mind Germany, which of course we had consolidated in Western Europe and had decided to rearm. And then Japan, with whom the Truman administration arranged a peace treaty. So there is a very obvious bubbling to the surface of tensions which had not been apparent before. I think we are pretty familiar with the impact on U.S. policy of North Korea's attack on the South. And I hesitate to go into it at any great length, both because of time differences and because I'd be repeating things that many of you know. But I think it's probably important to take some time to illuminate its effect on U.S. policies that made the United States seem completely oblivious to Nehru's concerns about moderating conflicts, using negotiations to settle problems that could expand, could lead to a world war in a nuclear age. And in order to do that, I have summarized. I hate to use the word briefly because I'm always using more time than I intend. But the actual events precipitating the Korean War were unavailable to the decision makers at that time, and so it really cannot be reinterpreted at the moment without distorting their own understanding. What we know now is that the Korean War was started on the initiative of the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung. It was based on war plans and promises of military supplies sanctioned by Stalin and the promise of volunteers by Mao. This was not known at the time that the war started. The Korean War, which could have been perceived as a nationalist civil conflict, primarily, and secondarily as an ideological confrontation involving the larger competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, in fact was immediately interpreted as an attack planned, supplied, and initiated by the USSR, which could only be stopped by force. It came down in the end to Acheson's formulation. The Soviets had mounted, and this is his own language, an open, undisguised attack to our internationally accepted position as the protector of South Korea, an area of great importance to the security of American-occupied Japan. To back away from this challenge, in view of our capacity for meeting it, would be highly destructive of the power and prestige of the United States. By prestige, and I think this is a wonderful phrase, I mean the shadow cast by power, which is of great deterrent importance. Therefore, we would not accept the conquest of this important area by a Soviet puppet under the very guns of our defensive perimeter. And what seems remarkable in retelling this story is how quickly the United States responded to this conflict, and in ways that changed the whole cast of American responses to Cold War crises that left very little room for negotiation. We can go back over this, but they simply say that the decisive factor transforming American Cold War doctrine occurred when President Truman accepted the Joint Report of State and Defense Planners, ready since April 1950 to combat the USSR for its aims of world domination. And this document, famous as NSC 68, left virtually no room for resolving conflicts with the Soviet Union through negotiation. It accepted Acheson's vision of creating situations of strength as a means to negotiation, therefore implicitly threatening war with the United States. And this is a strategy signed off by the Pentagon, the National Security Council, Department of State, President, CIA, and implemented by September 1950. Acheson was convinced that the Soviets considered negotiations war by political means, and suggestions for negotiations to resolve a crisis with the Soviet Union, such as the Korean War, as tantamount to appeasement. Now, the last issue that I want to take up, and I don't think I show the slide of the Korean War. This, of course, is Asia. This is a nice slide of the Korean War because it saves a lot of time and effort in describing how the North Koreans swept all the way down to Busan, how the counterattack brought MacArthur up to the Yalu, the temptation he had to use atomic weapons in order to complete the destruction of the Chinese forces who had sent their volunteers across. And then, after being dismissed, I think this is just a nice fairy tale now, a nice story. The Americans managed, remarkably, to regain ground in the South, and ultimately, after very tortuous negotiations, to sign an armistice, which left Korea more or less in the same division that it had been when the war started. So this was, again, a tragic part of the Cold War. It was a conflict which, on the American side, took some 39,000 lives altogether, about 50,000 lives, which need not have been fought for strategic reasons, but was considered absolutely necessary to fight for reasons of prestige and the shadow of power. And we find this, of course, happening again in Vietnam. Now, let us just spend some time on India, because after all, I'm reading the Nehru papers, and this is what I should promise to do. India's own China policy had been established before the Korean War. If one wants to describe it very briefly, it was a friendly approach. India became the first non-communist country to recognize China, and it pursued policies in its own interest that provided the underlying cause for growing suspicions about Nehru's motives. So we ought to end by looking at India's situation. At about the time that Nehru first went to the United States, first had the discussion with Atchison, first thought he might be able to cooperate with the United States in Asia and on China, he already knew from his ambassador in China, K.N. Panikkar, that communist forces were planning to invade Tibet by June 1950, and they would overrun Tibet with ease. This, of course, is just to move you a bit to a different part of Asia. And then, of course, that is the official map of India. And this is where the conflict was concentrated, in Tibet. So India knows that China is planning this kind of attack. The protection of Tibet's autonomous status, recognized by Great Britain from 1912 to 1947, devolved entirely onto India as a successor state. The independent government of India gave every indication of assuming British rights and obligations in Tibet, so long as a weak nationalist China was expected to remain in power. But India was faced with an entirely new situation after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, a strong centralized state which in 1950 had 5 million armed troops and 5 million reserves, compared to India's less than 400,000 men army. Drawing on old claims to paramountcy over Tibet, and ignoring the years since 1911 when China's suzerainty was nominal and Tibet's autonomy approximated independence, Mao announced the first priority of his government was to liberate Tibet. The stakes for India were very high. Treaties negotiated between British India and Tibet, establishing India's trade rights, but most important, the boundary on the northern Himalayan border, the McMahon Line, had never been accepted by China. Nehru had been advised and was aware that assurances by India to the Tibet government of protecting her sovereignty, if disregarded, would lead to the boundary defined in 1914 also being disregarded, and India would be exposed to renewed claims by China to the Assam tribal area. So if you're concerned about this kind of area here, you needed to have a border. And the McMahon Line was the border that had been inherited from the British. And this is where I'd really be interested in having some questions and comments. If ever Nehru could have convincingly asserted a superior position of legal and moral authority to question China's claims, it was on the autonomous status of Tibet. And this is what Nehru prided himself most on, his moral authority. At the same time, in challenging China on the issue of Tibet, at a minimum, he had to cooperate with the United States and the United Kingdom, both of whom quietly offered to transfer equipment to strengthen Tibet's capabilities for resistance. He refused to do this because it would align India de facto with the Western Bloc, which he was convinced did not understand the process of nationalist revolution at work in countries like Indonesia, Indochina, Malaya, that were rejecting colonial rule, and that, as he had discovered, and I've mentioned earlier, it was communism that was finding an ally in nationalism. If Nehru himself wanted to be relevant as the leader of groups emerging from colonialism, he had to resist that kind of identification with the West. But he was also misled in a sense, both by China and by his ambassador, about the depth of China's friendly feelings for India. He embarked on a very risky strategy. He indicated that his goals in Tibet would be accommodated by the formula of Tibet's autonomy under China's suzerainty without defining those terms. This was based on the assessment that India could only provide diplomatic support for rights derived from British Tibetan treaties, including the McMahon Line, and that given India's weakness, the only way to safeguard its interests, including these rights and the border, were by careful diplomatic negotiations that strengthened friendly relations between India and China. And in practice, this committed him to a foreign policy of avoiding all policies that could be viewed by China to be at its cost, and to gain gratitude and influence that would make it easier to prevail on the Chinese to respect India's treaty rights and the northern boundary. Nehru's friendly policies toward China rested also on an unexamined assumption. Subsequently, we know that was false. China's ties to the Soviet Union could be weakened. India's ties to China could be strengthened by becoming the foremost champion of Mao's demand in November 1949 to seat China in the United Nations in the Security Council and to take over Formosa from the nationalists. In fact, so close was the coordination on all policies between the Soviet Union and China that Stalin formally confirmed to Mao that he agreed with the Chinese comrades regarding the mediation of India on the question of the entry of the People's Republic into the membership of the UN. So whereas Nehru thought he was following his own independent foreign policy, he was actually following a policy that had been pre-approved by Stalin in coordination with Mao. Obviously, this situation made it much more difficult for New Delhi to follow a policy of friendly neutrality based on the merits in Asia. And there are many examples of this in the documents. I cannot mention even 2 or 3 here because it's, again, a matter of time, but one is very dramatic. India's decision to stand alone in refusing to attend the San Francisco conference at which the Japanese peace treaty was signed. Nehru specifically says to his sister, who was then ambassador to the United States and wanted India to sign, that I need to explain to you why I can't do it. I want you really to understand. And I can't do it because, quote, it would lead to almost a political break with China. We would have no logic left in any policy we pursue. Many of India's initiatives during the Korean War were recognized as efforts to resolve and limit the conflict through negotiation, and they were compatible with her overall approach to help preserve world peace. At the same time, on virtually every occasion when India did take an initiative, for example, leadership among the prime ministers of Commonwealth nations, the UK, Canada, and Australia, to pressure the United States into considering negotiations. Foremost among the demands she raised was membership of China in the United Nations, the transfer of Formosa to China, and the withdrawal of all foreign troops from Korea to leave the Koreans to make their own decisions. Atchison never wavered in refusing to pay China's price for the privilege of negotiating a ceasefire, the withdrawal of North Korean troops across the 38th parallel, and finally, voluntary repatriation of prisoners. All of this was accomplished in the end for various reasons, too long to discuss, with the cooperation of the Soviet Union. India ultimately paid the biggest price for her friendly approach. The total incorporation of Tibet into China in 1953 and the 1962 India-China border war over the McMahon line. In addition, the legacy of this policy was an enduring suspicion, certainly during the Eisenhower years, and particularly the Secretary of State, Dulles, that India had been playing China's game of excluding American influence from Asia to realize the dream of Asia for Asians. And at the beginning of the Eisenhower administration, it was a very easy decision for Dulles to take, to sign the military assistance agreement with Pakistan and to, in Nehru's words, build down India and build up Pakistan. I think I will stop.
Thank you, Francine. I'm going to ask a question because I can't resist, but then I'm going to turn it over to folks here in the room. Since we are being webcast, we need to ask you to wait until we get a microphone to you so that the people out in webcast land can also hear the question. Francine, I am struck by what is a new thought for me, and that is the way in which you juxtaposed the Korean War with the almost simultaneous Chinese moves into Tibet, which leads to the following question. Nehru, you suggested, had a successful trip to the United States in 1949. In mid-1950, China then takes actions vis-a-vis Tibet, which could only have been, as you've suggested, immensely alarming and disturbing to Nehru. And then 4.5 or 5 months after that, at the end of 1950, the first Chinese troops come into armed conflict with the United States troops in Korea. Given the first two of those three episodes, I find it still a bit difficult to understand why Nehru would not have been more sympathetic to the dilemma in which the United States found itself facing Chinese troops at the end of 1950. Why it seems that almost immediately Nehru was inclined to give the Chinese the benefit of the doubt, given what had transpired in the last 18 months prior to that.
I think this is a tragic juxtaposition and a very serious question. Nehru thought that he might be able to help solve both of these problems by, on the one hand, demonstrating that he was a real friend of China, so that his credentials would not be questioned. He worked very hard to get China admitted into the United Nations, and the Chinese expressed a great deal of appreciation to him for his efforts. He voted for the UN resolutions that condemned the aggression by North Korea into the South. He voted for the second resolution that established the UN command. But his problems began in squaring the circle when the United States, among the steps it took, sent the Seventh Fleet into the Straits to protect Formosa from attack by the Chinese. According to dispatches from his ambassador, the Chinese had been ready to go to capture or take over Taiwan. The United States had sent troops and reinforcements to the Philippines, to Indochina. So here he was, sympathetic to what the United States had done to repel these attacks. At the same time, he was more and more concerned that the United States was in fact reverting to type, that it was going to support colonial regimes in Southeast Asia in order to contain communism or the spread of communism. This is the beginning, really, of the domino theory that we cannot lose China and then permit the loss of Korea. And then if we lose Korea and the Chinese are already on the border of Indochina, the United States is going to react by reinforcing nationalist groups, which will only compound the difficulty that they will turn against the West. And so he could not see himself in a close alignment with the West.
Thank you. Questions? Sig Harrison. Sig, wait till we get the microphone, please.
Well, I just wondered if you could fill in a chapter that I think you left out just for reasons of time, which is the Indian role in the Korean peace. General Tamaya, and how was this perceived in Washington, and did that contribute in any way to did that help to add to the feelings you describe, or was it not relevant?
I think that the Indians were considered to play a very constructive role in the whole complex debate about repatriating prisoners of war. reservation, I suppose, the United States would have, because after all, this was an ideological struggle. And so it was very important, and Tamayo points this out, that the U.S. could show many more numbers of Chinese troops and North Korean troops refusing repatriation. Then, of course, the Koreans and Chinese communists could demonstrate wanted to leave Korea and China. So this was an ideological battle between both sides. Tamayo tried his best to actually administer this process very fairly, but it could be quite difficult. And even in respect of fairness, and this is where India is hoist with its own petard in a way. What the Indians did was to view the Chinese and the U.S. as equal. We viewed ourselves as good, and we viewed the Chinese as evil. How can you then treat good and evil equally? So the Indians had a really thankless problem in trying to hold the balance evenly. I think they did the best that they could in this situation. And I remember talking to someone who ultimately became a foreign minister, not a foreign minister, but the foreign secretary of the government of India, about his time in China during the repatriation. And he wrote the report for Tamayo. And he was simply reminiscing about the attitude, the mindset of the Indians who were there at the time. The Indians were all pro-Chinese at that time. I mean, at this level. And this man does become very senior, and as I say, he writes this report. And they loved to make fun of the Americans, and not necessarily because the Americans were doing anything terribly wrong. They weren't doing anything worse than what the Chinese were doing. On the balance, they probably were better than the Chinese. But they were very rich, and they had beautiful uniforms, and they lived in real houses, and they were able to spend any amount of money, remember he said, in getting electricity for their quarters, and they could run these lines, for miles and miles across roads and so on. And this made the Americans figures of fun to the Indians. They said they were just much happier being with the Chinese. They felt that they were in the same condition, the same situation. So there was a natural camaraderie with the Chinese that somehow failed to develop with the Americans.
I neglected to ask each of our questioners if you'll introduce yourself. That was, of course, Selig Harrison. Prakash?
I have two questions.
You want to introduce yourself, Prakash?
Oh, sorry. I'm Prakash Ambegaonkar from Bridging Nations. One question is regarding the period you just described. I want to focus on the Taiwan or Formosa that was called at the time, and the Tibet. If the United States went to such a large extent to protect the Taiwan issue, independence or sovereignty or whatever you call it, why didn't the United States do anything about Tibet? That's one question. And secondly, some of these proclivities or issues or psychology of the periods of leadership at that time, feeling closer to China as against the United States. To what extent, if we move fast forward as of now, you think those attitudes are changed between these three countries?
The reason why the U.S. did nothing about Tibet is, first of all, the United States was very far removed from Tibet in physical terms. It had no intention of fighting a second mountainous war in Tibet. But that's not the whole story. The United States, as I mentioned, did suggest to India at the time that the Chinese army moved, we are willing to be helpful. We're willing to do it quietly. We are willing to supply the Tibetans so that they can resist to the extent possible or slow down this invasion, and then maybe we can find some kind of solution. It was India who said, the best thing you can do is do nothing. We don't want you in this region. All that will happen is the Chinese, who at the time were saying the imperialists were behind these protests about China's move into Tibet, that will give credence to their charges. So please don't do anything. And without India's support, the United States really could not do anything. India was the power with responsibility for protecting the autonomy of Tibet. Now, are the attitudes different today? Well, yes, they would have to be. A long time has intervened since 1962. I think there's every effort being made to build feelings of friendship between the two countries. I also think that there is a residual uneasiness among many Indians about the rise of China. And while they will not say this for the record, they do certainly feel it's necessary for India to move very quickly to catch up with China. And the current agreement between the United States and India paving the way for a security relationship is considered to be in India's interest. And the Chinese appear to be rather unhappy with it.
If I can just very quickly put an addendum, I'm not sure whether it started as early as 1950 or early 50s or not until later in the decade, but certainly by the end of the 50s, the United States had a very large clandestine anti-Chinese operation going on in Tibet, involving arming people, parachuting people into Tibet. So, as I say, I'm not quite sure how early in the 50s that started, but it was a major operation. I'm going to take Dennis and then Dave, and then I think I saw a hand over there, and I've got more hands here too. Dennis?
Oh, hi. One thing you
want to introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah, Dennis Cooks from the Woodrow Wilson Center. One area I don't think you touched on, which seemed to me was very important in the drifting apart of India and the United States, was Kashmir. Because it seems to me that from almost the beginning on the Indian side, Nehru was annoyed at the British, but also annoyed at the Americans. And on the American side, it wasn't, I don't think you had the same reaction immediately, but there was a gradual buildup of which the Americans just get annoyed at the Indians, because et cetera. And but it both fit together in contributing to the malaise in the relationship, I think.
It certainly was a very important issue. It consumes a lot of time and cables and meetings and so on. Again, by itself, I don't think it would have done lasting damage to the relationship between the United States and India. I mean, Nehru was as angry at the United States as the U.S. was impatient with Nehru. The Indians really could not understand, I think they still don't, why the United States would favor Pakistan's claim to Kashmir when what it implied was approval for the creation of nations based on religion. And in fact, when I say Nehru had the one disagreement with Atchison, it was on Kashmir. And Atchison, I think, simply was stumped in the end. I mean, Nehru apparently had a very long dissertation about Kashmir and what Indians' feelings were about it, and and Atchison finally said, "Well, look, I'm too confused. I don't want to deal with this," because he was a liberal who was not going to make an argument for creating a state on the basis of religion, and so I think there wasn't any real possibility of dialogue. And in the end, everyone who tried to resolve this problem concluded that neither India nor Pakistan would ever compromise. They each wanted the whole thing. And so it was a problem for Solomon that still hasn't been solved.
Dave Rutgers.
Dave Rutgers, independent historian and sometime Woodrow Wilson hanger-on. You made a passing mention of India's China War of 1962. A number of years ago, a British journalist by the name Neville Maxwell brought out a book of that title, which I read and enjoyed, but I know a lot of Indians don't like it. So how would you assess that book?
It seems, again, from declassified documents, and I've only found them here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, so I'm very pleased, that the Chinese in 1959, I think you referred to the CIA operations at that time, were very upset by the flight of the Dalai Lama to India. And that was assisted by the CIA. The Indians did not allow the Dalai Lama to establish a government in exile, which they could have done, but they gave him sanctuary. And it appeared as if, from China's point of view, Nehru must have allowed that to happen because their assessment of Nehru was that he was in control of everything. So their other problem with Nehru was, and this is from transcripts of discussions between Khrushchev and Mao and the top leadership. Their other problems with Nehru were that after all of this, Nehru, cornered by public opinion, that was one factor, on charges of appeasement of China, had no more room for maneuver. And he had to make some kind of movement toward protecting India's frontiers, and especially because border clashes had occurred. He did start moving these markers up toward the McMahon line. In some cases, apparently, he went over the McMahon line, but he never understood the possibility that conflicts could be more than localized, could be clashes, that it would never come to a war. And even at that point, I think, he did not have in his mind a category for something that Sardar Patel, the deputy prime minister long ago in the 1950s, called communist imperialism. It seems never to have occurred to him that by making these small movements, the Chinese could actually cross the border. And the Chinese, who are defending themselves in this conversation to Khrushchev, who's saying, you know, why are you doing this? Why are you destroying neutralist India? It may lead the way to the takeover by much more bourgeois anti-Chinese forces. And Mao is saying it doesn't matter. Nehru is totally in control. He's totally rigid. He's never going to change his attitude. He's never going to become a communist. And even if he's displaced from government and these reactionaries take his place, that's good, because India will become ripe for revolution. And so, yes, Neville Maxwell is right on one level, but basically the Chinese were, I think, prepared at this point to destroy Nehru if they had to. He was not, in the end, in the very end, after all of this giveaway in Tibet and so on, he would not betray his national interest and sign over any part of India on the border to the Chinese.
One more question on this side. Yes. Okay.
Vinod Basujit from the Embassy of Mauritius. You mentioned Krishna Menon, but did not dwell much on him, and leaving the impression that he did not have much influence on foreign policy. Could you, explain, in a few words, what was his role in India's foreign policy?
I have to think that through very carefully, because I do expect to write a chapter on Krishna Menon and Nehru. It's a very complicated relationship, but I think it's safe to say that Krishna Menon had a constant influence on Nehru, except for a short period of time when he himself became ill. And Krishna Menon was, I think we probably agree, very pro-Soviet, unsuspecting of the Chinese, and he had an influence which was at the end almost total in blocking access to Nehru. He became a member of parliament. He became the defense minister. He wrote many of the cables that came from the Ministry of External Affairs. And Nehru came to rely on him to a great extent, and in the end actually came to think that attacks on Krishna Menon were actually attacks on him. So it was a very complicated relationship, a very close relationship, and it does need a lot of study.
I think there's been a hand over on this side. Did I see a hand? Okay, we have time for one more back in the back. Yes.
Peter Bogart from the German Institute of Global and Regional Studies. This is just, linked back to exactly what we just discussed. Actually, at that time, there must have been pretty close relationships, certainly economic-wise, between India and the Soviet Union. I assume you highlight this in this book too, and it was left out here in this lecture. Can we just briefly just look at it?
The economic relations between India and the Soviet Union did not start during the Nehru period. So one would have to fast forward to Indira Gandhi's time. But again, what may be interesting to note is that India needed to have economic support from the United States. India did not want to ask the United States for economic support. And that was true from the very beginning. But what becomes really interesting is that when it runs out of money for its second five-year plan, that was critical. And the only source was the United States. Nehru would not take money directly from the United States because he was so convinced that it would create a dependence. And in order to persuade Nehru to take money for economic development, because the United States was always concerned that India as a democracy should prosper relative to communist China, an arrangement was worked out, which we now know is the consortium led by the World Bank. And all aid for India's five-year plans was channeled through the World Bank consortium as an invention to prevent Nehru from having to ask directly for funds from the United States.
That's a fascinating note to end because it will simply further whet our appetite to read your book. Join me, if you will, in expressing our appreciation to Francine Franklin.